Hi, I'm Philip. I want to talk a bit about deployments and stuff that can go well or not so well. I work for Elastic, the company behind the Elasticsearch, Logstash, Kibana, Beats. Probably some people use the Elk stack, or now we call it the Elastic stack for logging. I don't want to talk about this specific topic in this talk. I have another session after lunch about that. This is just more like deployments in general, poking a bit of fun against various things. So I'm doing infrastructure stuff at Elastic, and then I always say I piped that out. That is a Unix pipe into developer advocacy. So the developer, avocado or whatever we call ourselves. So any confessions? No? Okay, let's get started then. Which sin is that? And I guess everybody's awake now. Gluttony, right. The overindulgence and overconsumption of anything to the point of waste, which is oftentimes like add all the dependencies, which PHP is doing pretty well, I think. I see that more. I've done a lot of Java as well, and there is often like add all the stuff and like make one thing that you deploy that is like 200 megabytes, and there you will feel it like you need more memory, you need more disk. You need just more network just to transfer or deploy your applications to the point where it really is painful. For example, one of my favorite examples there is the AWS API, which used to be very large. Because as soon as you were using anything from the AWS ecosystem, you had to have like a 13 megabyte dependency just for that. So just if you were using Amazon S3, you pulled in 13 megabytes of dependencies for every single time you were deploying. And if you're deploying frequently, that will add up over time. But they figured out at some point this is not viable, and they have broken it down into smaller chunks. And then breaking down things into smaller chunks is becoming now more common. Unless you're using Docker, then it's still people complaining about having a big jar, and suddenly you have like the entire JVM or whatever runtime you have, and you deploy that with some operating system, and suddenly you have like, oh, half a gigabyte or something of that you deploy. But nobody's questioning that because, well, Docker is very popular. But we'll get back to Docker. And then there are the people who say like, oh, we should split up things into smaller entities. And there's this Bill Gates job about the 640K ought to be enough for anybody. And if you're doing Node, then you probably have the problem that can my application fit into 640K dependencies? And that sounds a bit like too strong. But sometimes you see stuff you would not believe. For example, once I found these here. Somebody made packages for emojis. There is a package for every, or a dependency for every single emoji that is out there. And I'm really surprised that you need a 3-digit version code for emojis. And these are, by the way, all unit tested. And I'm not even sure what they're doing. But they have so much metadata around that it's kind of amazing. That is the Node ecosystem. And then it's like combine all the projects, or rather right now we have the opposite trend, like split up all the projects in whatever microservices that you have. And that is what lots of people are doing. Like we're converting to microservices, and our architecture looks something like this in the end, which will work very well, I guess. Who is doing something like that? Anybody? Okay, one brave soul daring to raise their hand. The other thing is, like, if you want to sound fancy, people often say, like, oh, we have something micro, like we just have very short names, and then it's kind of micro as well in there. But why stop at microservices? Like, the next step is nanoservices. And you can go on, like, Pico, Femto, Atto. The smallest thing that is out there are Yocto services. That is probably serverless then when you have one function in a thing, and that's also very popular. That would be kind of the Yocto service thing you could throw out there. And then this is, by the way, the only thing that is true that Gartner is bringing out, like their hype cycle. Everything else, what they do is pretty much guessing. And depending on where you are in a specific technology, you have this peak of inflated expectations, and then you fall down into this shroud of disillusionment. And then at some point, you maybe reach that plateau of productivity. That is when a lot of people say, this is legacy now. And this has kind of this bad undertone. However, don't forget, like, legacy is not always that bad because legacy has kind of survived long enough and is what is making money most of the times. Even though it has this very bad connotation of, yeah, this has become legacy and this is very bad. So I don't want to bash microservices in general. They do help, like if you have too many people or too many dependencies or it's not scalable or you need independent scale, then microservices are great, but oftentimes this is a luxury problem you don't really have. Does it solve all your problems? You could believe it if you listen to conference talks where it's all microservices. But yeah, unfortunately, it's probably not. Because there are these things as problems around distributing things. I guess a lot of you have heard about the 8 fallacies of distributed computing, which came out of good old Sun Microsystem, rest in peace, who found like various problems around that. And who remembers that one? Twitter fail whale. Like they were having or learning rough lessons around that, where stuff was failing very frequently. I think that the proper logo they should have always used for that is this one. But you don't see that much anymore because they have kind of learned the lesson. Through a lot of pain and outages, they have learned. And there's one of the really good blog posts around there is from Jeff Hodges. He has been with Twitter, or he had been for a long time. And he basically wrote a detailed blog post about the things that they learned and that were failing. And it is not that you have latency, but that things are failing independently. And you need to make sure your system stays up and still works if something fails. Because if you have lots of different pieces, something will always fail. But it should not impact your entire system. Because they had examples, they were adding some translation systems for, I think, Japanese or something like that. And they didn't have some internal rate limits, and then something was killing that specific service. But that was then killing the site for everybody. And it was just like, they found a lot of internal dependencies and broken things. And it took them a long time to figure that out. And well, if you have enough VC and enough people, you can do that. But maybe it's not worth that for every single project. Since I speak German, these are my 9s. And then you see resiliency, availability, scalability, reliability. Does it even work? And it's still, those are the 5 9s that you're targeting, basically. On the other hand, if you have like, does it even work? Sometimes for some services, it might be easier to tell you if it did work and not if it did not work. And then some people are like, oh, microservices, is this like SOA done right? Who is old enough to remember SOA, the initial SOA? Okay, that is very few. I was at university and it's like, oh, you just build services and probably reusable services and nobody will do any software anymore. You just build something once and then you reuse services forever. And it will be awesome. Luckily, it was not, or because we would probably be all out of a job if it had been like that you build something and then we will be able to reuse it forever. But that was the initial idea. And then people were also like jumping on the SOA hype train that was like probably 10 years ago. And even back then, people were doing it like, yeah, you need to do SOA now. So we will, whatever we have, we'll just call him, it, whatever, a SOA. And that is what you do to get around any naming problems then. Which resulted in the WS Death Star. You remember if you were doing SOAP, like you had all these WS standards about everything like transaction security. There was a standard for everything that nobody properly implemented. But you had like all these standards about that. And yeah, actually SOAP was totally misnamed because it was not simple. It was not about objects. It was actually more like crap, which would have been the right name for that one. Who uses Wireshark? Wireshark is pretty cool unless you have a highly distributed application, right? Because otherwise it turns more into a murder mystery where you have like some pieces here, some pieces there, and then you start like a detective, you start tracing bits and pieces all around. And you don't know really what is happening anymore, you just try to find your traces of what is even going on. What is that? No, Star Wars is not the answer I was looking for. Yeah, those are the microservices with a shared database. That is one of these very common patterns that you see every now and then. Like, yeah, we do microservices, we still have our monolithic database, and you're always like, yep, good luck on that one. That is going very well. Who is trying to work around that by using a queue? Like Kafka. Yeah. Then you have a monolithic stream store. Good luck. It's pretty much the same thing. It's still the one thing that everything depends on, and you build everything around that. So you might make your life a bit harder if you distribute the rest, but you have still this one thing that will kill your application. Yeah. Where to start? Probably not with something highly distributed. A good single monolithic application might be the right place where to start. Don't split them out into different services. Martin Fowler, he's very widely known around that, and he has written some awesome blog posts. And he also compares how your microservice architecture, or how your architecture looked like 10 years ago and how it's looking today. And it's something like this. And you can see the complexity that we have added is, some might call it job security. Because once you are kind of like very deep into some of these things, like nobody will ever be able to replace you, because it's very hard to find somebody with all these tools that you have and all the knowledge that you have in there. Like this one, probably pretty much anybody could do. This one here will be a bit more challenging, but that's kind of like the next level architecture that everybody is trying to get to. That, on the other hand, I think is very reasonable. Microservices are not like a one-axis thing. It's like basically you have two axes. One is the number of deployment units, and the other one is the modularity. And if your modularity is bad, you have either a monolithic big ball of mud, or you have a distributed big ball of mud. But it's still a big ball of mud if you don't have like a good modularity. Whereas otherwise, if you have good modularity, it doesn't really matter if it's like you roll it out in one piece or in multiple pieces. That will still work much better. But it's not about like having small deployment units, because they will not save you if the rest is still crap. And probably the problem about the good old monolith is that the name is just not very cool anymore. So if you would call it Uber Container, Stereolith, or Backup Platform, it probably would be much more popular. However, my personal favorite would be Server Full, just because that might be something is in there. Yeah. And you can still just throw everything into a Docker container and then just call it a microservice, even though it's not. That will not fix anything around your architecture. The other things that you really need to do is, if you distribute stuff, is you need some centralized logging. Otherwise, well, who is SSHing and tailing into 20 servers at the same time? Anybody? No? Okay, nobody wants to admit that. But that's what happens if you just like split stuff out without having the proper architecture. And I think Netflix is investing like 15% or so of all their work, and also like what they're spending on infrastructure, on just making sure they can monitor their entire systems, because it just becomes much more important to kind of keep track where is what and what is even going on. So you want to centralize your logs, and also you want to have some correlation IDs. So if one call comes in and then touches 20 services, you still want to follow that one call throughout your architecture to see what is going wrong and where might stuff be slow. Because otherwise, the worst problem to have is somebody comes to you and says like, your application is slow, and you don't have any idea where to start. Because independently, every single service looks okay-ish, but as a whole, it's still very slow. Yeah. Sam Newman, he's very big in the microservice ecosystem, but even he says like, for small teams, he needs to be, or he still is not convinced that microservices is the right thing. And if you have like 5 times the number of services, the number of people you have working on them, maybe this is also like the smell of some kind of anti-pattern. If you don't have multiple people working on one service, it might not be the right thing. So everybody repeat after me. I'm not Facebook, Google, or Amazon. I know we all want to be, and we would want to have their problems, but maybe we are not. Or maybe I don't know about you. Who is working for one of these companies here? Then you would be exempt, but no. Okay. Okay, there's no point in asking which sin is that, because it's pretty obvious that one is greed. The excessive or rapacious desire and pursuit of material possession. And I have a single slide for that one, which is, anybody has ever worked with that one? J-Boss? Anybody has good memories about that one? No. Yes. I have the same. I did use that at university, and I remember it took 5 minutes to start up, and every redeploy took 90 seconds. And after 3 or 4 redeploys, you had an out-of-memory exception, and then you would start from the beginning. And it felt like, okay, this is not going anywhere. And I've heard that they've renamed and everything is much better now. I'm still suspicious. It's like, if you're very greedy, I don't trust you afterwards anymore. Which sin is that? Sloth, exactly. The laziness. We should not be lazy. I will emphasize the kind of spiritual laziness. Let's do stuff continuously. So when do we want it continuously? Generally, you have like the continuous integration. You build and test every push. Who is doing that? That is not even half of the room. Okay. You roll out manually to production, but you automatically deploy to development, which is continuous delivery. Who is doing that? Okay. And continuous deployment, rolling out to production automatically. Who is doing that? Okay, that's still fewer. Okay, but some, which probably looks something like this. You're sitting on the train, you're rolling it out, and you hope you don't derail at the same time. And most of the time, it's probably going well. And then some people say like, oh, this entire continuous delivery thing could be compared to an LSD trip. And you just basically replace a few words in there. And that's what kind of the same thing is. So it's more about an experience that you get. For example, you replace LSD with continuous deployment, and then instead of meditation, it's your business, and then self becomes DevOps, and then you're pretty much the same thing. But some people really like it. And then you have all the buzzwords. You can throw that in. Oh, first you do Agile, then in continuous integration, delivery, deployment, and then you do DevOps. Nobody knows what DevOps is. And probably every conference has a few talks about this is DevOps, or this is not DevOps, or we do DevOps, or we don't do DevOps, or whatever DevOps. But yeah, this is one of the things that you just throw out there. We have covered all the buzzwords. The thing about rolling out stuff continuously might not be required for everybody. For example, this little site called Facebook, up until about a year ago, they had, I think for the UI, they had 3 daily releases, but for the backend, they had a weekly release. And if that was not holding them back until a year ago, maybe it doesn't hold you back. I don't mean to say like you should not do continuous deployments. It's just not, it might not be as kind of required as you might think. And yeah, 60% of the time the deployments work every time. That is also something that you might get from some of your applications, that you keep continuously trying to roll them out until it finally works. And then people say like DDDs actually, for the ops people, it's davai deploy, which is kind of like roll out that shit. Other people say it's the deadline-driven deployment, which is my favorite for DDD. This is, I think, the one that everybody should keep in mind when they deploy. And yeah, continuous delivery can also mean that you're stuck on it and have been trying for 5 days continuously to deploy your application. That is also a form of continuous. And then some people question like, is it a continuous life cycle or is it a continuous death cycle that you're trying to roll out your application, it's failing every time? Who's using Jenkins? Who is happily using Jenkins? 1, 2, 3. Are you CloudBees employees? Are you working for CloudBees, the company behind it? No, I'm joking. I know a lot of people have kind of like complicated relationship to Jenkins. We have like, I don't know, like 50 Jenkins slaves testing our stuff all the time. And we have 3 people working on Jenkins full time. And I don't know anybody who hates Jenkins as much as those 3. And I try to really stay away from it. And I've seen this one, and I think that is really a good comparison. So sometimes Jenkins is kind of a jerk, sometimes it's junk, and sometimes it's just like jank, where you have no idea what is even going on. Which doesn't mean that there is any better system, but you know, there are the systems who everybody hates, and there are then the systems who nobody uses, and you can kind of pick where you want to go. Who always has a red build? Anybody? No? Okay. cool. Because I know some places who are using Jenkins and they're building every push, but it's always red, so nobody cares anymore. So you do continuous integration, but it's always red, and I'm not sure that is really the point of doing continuous integration when you don't really see anything change. What I do think is a very good pattern is to change or separate code and configuration. What I've seen in the past is when people had, like, I don't know, we have the database string hard-coded in our application, and then we changed something around our database connection, and then we have to redeploy the entire application just because we need to roll out the DNS change. That will be very painful if you need to re-roll a lot of applications because of that. And never commit your secrets into any form of version control or anywhere. Because what very often happens is somebody writes an internal tool and then you say, oh, we'll just commit the credentials in there, it's fine, nobody will know, nobody cares. And after 3 years or so, somebody else says, oh, this is a cool tool, we could open source that, we should do something for the open source community. I'll clean this up a bit, nobody sees it or knows about the credentials anymore. You push it to GitHub and, well, the next day you have a farm mining cryptocurrencies. And your bill will be very high. Don't commit anything. I know that, for example, AWS is now actively scanning GitHub for GitHub API tokens because they know that so many people are doing that. But unfortunately, the bad guys are doing that as well, and then it's kind of a race who is quicker to find the API token to start something. And also don't believe like you can just push something out and then after 5 minutes you realize what you have done and then rebase the commit to get it out and then push it again so it's not there anymore. Because I've heard stories that the bad guys are kind of like subscribing to random repositories and just scan every push. So even if you rebase and it's not in your history anymore, once you have pushed it out, your tokens are probably compromised. Which sin is that? Which is very dark. Anybody remembers? Anybody watched Se7en recently? The intense and uncontrolled desire, which oftentimes is this. Always use the hottest shit. So for some, that is this blockchain thing. Even though blockchain sounds very fancy, if you give it the low throughput, append-only database, very expensive transactions, it just doesn't sound as fancy as blockchain. But luckily, we don't have to do many blockchain things for deployments. What we more often use is this, Docker. Who's using Docker? I guess load. Who's using Docker in production? Okay, that's quarter, even less. Okay. It's always funny when people say like, oh, we'll just use Docker because it makes our deployment so easy when you have a team that deploys once a quarter. That might not help you that much. And then some people are like, oh, but our containers are so large. And that is actually the reason why I think they have the mascot as a whale. And I know containers are supposed to be small, but oftentimes they're not. Who has containers who are smaller than 100 megabytes? Okay. Who has containers that are larger than 500 megabytes? Okay. Yeah, I think this is the right Docker logo. And we are all the little Nemo fish down here. And we will be eaten alive at some point. Oftentimes, or kind of, I like the idea of Docker. That you have, everybody has this one colleague who always says like, it worked on my machine and nowhere else. And you know what the only kind of solution for that is? At some point, you will need to tell them, back up your email, your laptop is going to production now. Because this is the only place where this works. Keep that in mind. If you ever have that problem, tell them to back up their email. Yeah, this is what Docker basically gives you. You have like all these nice little containers. Do you all remember Nemo? Like the fish need to escape from the fish tank and they kind of get into these baggies and then roll out and then they're in the sea. But it's kind of like you didn't really reach your end goal. You have like these nice packages like, oh, we have a Dockerized application. But this is not really what you wanted to achieve. This might be a nice step in between, but it's not solving any of your problems. And then some people say, yeah, the nice thing about Docker is that it's all containers, so it's all the same. And then some people say like, oh yeah, these are all tires. They're all on fire, but it's all simple because, well, tires. And yeah, containers everywhere. This is what you do. And you see kind of the skeptical look. That's like, yeah, just saying containers don't solve all your problems. Who is agreeing to that? a container is just a process, so it's simple. The problem is suddenly this one process has its own network layer and its own storage layer, which might be totally different depending on your host operating systems. And the amount of issues we see around running Elasticsearch in containers, it's like more than half of that is basically Docker support and not Elasticsearch support anymore. Because people who are kind of like don't know Unix principles like permissions, like file system permissions that well, are bound to reinvent them, but kind of poorly often. It's kind of a common problem that people think, oh, everybody uses Docker, Docker must be simple. Unfortunately, Docker is not that simple, and it's kind of a leaky abstraction. You still need to know a lot of stuff around it. And then oftentimes you're like, oh, I'm too old for this shit, which every now and then might happen. And also containers will not solve your broken architecture. Because, for example, here you can see we have lots of containers, and each one of these containers is doing okay. But probably your application as a whole is not doing that okay anymore. And this is what you get with containers. Like, yes, awesome, container works. Does my application work? No really direct relationship between that. Or if you have like some security issue in your containers, you will still need to re-roll all your containers to fix that. So you will still need a process to re-roll everything and fix out security things. Also, the nice thing is suddenly you have a full set of new dependencies. For example, for us, Elasticsearch is running on Java. Previously, we had like to fix security issues in our software and in our direct dependencies. But now, if you have an official Docker container, suddenly you have the operating system you have packaged in there, or at least the kernel, plus the JVM that you need to package in there as a dependency as well. And so if there is some security issue around that, you will need to re-roll all your containers afterwards, like maybe even 1 year later, even though you have released the software a year ago. If you still support that, you might need to re-roll your containers continuously, which is also not that much fun. Who has ever tried that? If you do docker compose down -v, it removes all your volumes. If you do docker compose -v down, it prints the version of docker compose. Which is kind of similar, but especially if you have loaded a bit of data into your volumes, probably not exactly what you want if you mix them up. Yeah. And for example, if you're on the JVM, you probably have like something, and you just throw it into the JVM, and that is more or less your abstraction or container. You don't need to do that much anymore. What is this? Any guesses? A containerized legacy application. Because you can't totally put COBOL into a container, but it's still COBOL afterwards. It doesn't solve your problems around COBOL for that. And then some people say like, oh, we'll use microservices and containers, and then we'll have the proper cargo cult. And Dilbert describes it best. It's like, oh, the successful companies, they're doing golf tournaments, so we're doing golf tournaments, and that way we'll be successful. And that is what it feels like a lot of companies are doing. It's like, you don't really know what successful companies are doing, but you're kind of trying to repeat their motions. So you don't really understand what is making somebody successful, but you're just trying to imitate parts of what they're doing, and you think then success will come to you. However, that does not always work that well. For example, just because Google is doing something doesn't mean it's the right thing for you. Because Google, for example, is building their own file system. Is anybody here building their own file system? I once had a colleague who was like that. He wanted to reinvent everything. We did not watch him for 1 day, and he was writing his own encoding, which is also a very bad idea. He didn't do a file system, but yeah. If you want to do something that Google is doing, think about if that really makes sense for you. And some people say that, oh, it's all about speed. It's not really about the reliability anymore. As long as you can do that davai deploy, if it really works afterwards, nobody cares that much. What is wrong here? So I'm using a very simple example of I want to run Elasticsearch. Anything that might be weird or that might be a problem afterwards. Sorry? Sorry, after reboot? Yeah, that might be. Yeah, that is true. That might be a problem. Yes, that is also true. I mean something on the last line. Anything on the last line that is missing or too much. Yes, there is no version. Which is maybe okay-ish if you have a stateless service, because you probably always want to roll out the latest version, even though that can also be questionable, because then you might have like various versions deployed and run into conflicts. The problem is if you have any data store that is probably running for a longer time, unless it's like some kind of development mode. This will always get latest, but maybe latest in 6 months is a different major version. So if you have a cluster today with this running and you decide to add 3 more nodes in half a year, you might screw up your entire cluster because you have different major versions then. That is why this will actually not work, because we don't support latest for our containers. And we probably get a GitHub issue for that like every 1 or 2 months, that somebody says, the latest tag is missing. And we're like, no, 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 this is not a bug, this is a feature. We don't have latest because we know that somebody will screw up their cluster, and that somebody will then come to us, probably with a pitchfork, and complain mightily. And we don't want that to happen. And we always say this is a zombie. Something that should have been killed a long time ago, but is still around and keeps shambling along. It's that, oh, latest is so great. And depending on your dependency management system, like some do support latest, some don't. Some have even removed latest as a dependency, because normally you already have too much variation in your build. You don't want to have this, oh, maybe there is a new version out today, let's add latest to just make everything fail randomly. The other thing around containers that we see every now and then, can you, for example, run Elasticsearch as root? Anybody? Yes? No? Yes? No? No, you cannot. This is a feature. If you try to start the process as root, we will system exit. And the only way to not system exit there is fork the source code and comment out the system exit. And we will not change that. And we thought this was kind of like good best practice. However, this is like the cockroaches. They disappear for a while and then they come back. So everybody kind of agreed, if you were running a service on, a service on your server, you should not run that as root. For example, Nginx will start as root because it's using a low port, but it will then drop the permissions. So even if you exploit Nginx, you will not get root on that node. Elasticsearch runs by default on port 9200, so a high port. We don't even need root permissions to start on that port, so we never need root. We just don't do that. But now that you have Docker, people have come to us and say like, oh, our best practice, whatever kind of best practice it is to run everything as root in containers, because it's an isolated process anyway, and we want to run everything as root. And we strongly disagree, and we will not fix that for anybody. If you believe that, you will kind of, I don't know, you will need to fork the source code. But this is like stuff that disappears for a while, and then kind of like you have something new, like Docker, and suddenly everything reappears. And yeah, and if you're in the Java ecosystem, you can make jars. Like, you don't need big application servers anymore. You can just package everything together in a nice fashion. Serverless. Who's using serverless? Or Lambda or whatever? That's fewer than I was expecting. And it's always like serverless, because obviously there are servers involved, and nobody's thinking there are no servers involved, but it's still kind of like something that people always joke about. So for example, this is what serverless might look like. Just sit in your car and ride along on serverless. This is going to be awesome. The other thing is, you might have that burden B discussion with the junior people, that serverless is still made out of actual hardware, which I think makes a lot of sense. This is kind of the future. We started off with serverless, then we went codeless, and soon we will probably be architectureless. And then we roll out of a job. No, it won't happen. Luckily, it won't happen. But what you will probably get is that in a few years' time, that all the new technical debt will be serverless, because it's some random function you have thrown into a cloud provider and that is running, and nobody knows what is even out there and what is being called anymore. And some people say, like, is that PaaS, the platform as a service, reborn? Who has used a PaaS? Nobody. Okay. I remember when I was at university, we were always promised like, oh, infrastructure as a service where you run the server yourself. This is the thing of the past. Nobody wants to run servers themselves. Like, platform as a service is the future. It didn't really quite happen back then, but now with serverless, we're kind of getting closer. And is it the same thing? Probably only if your good old PaaS was able to start up in 20 milliseconds, and then you could bill it by the second or just run it for half a second. Then PaaS is probably the same as serverless, but that is one of the attributes that you really like, or that people really like about serverless. It's just like this one thing you want to run for a short time, and then you throw it away again. So if you have this one weekly cron job, having a server run the entire week to run a cron job Sunday night is probably not the best thing. It's not very energy efficient. I know, thanks to Bitcoin, nobody cares about energy efficiency anymore. But it's probably not going the right way. Okay, pride. Believing one is better than somebody else. Who identifies as dev here? Who would identify as ops? Okay, not that many. Who in ops knows this problem? Nobody? Okay, because I know some shops where people are like, oh, we developed something, it's fun, we'll use MongoDB, we'll develop in MongoDB for 2 weeks, and afterwards, the ops have to support it for 5 years. Good luck there. Which is kind of a bit of an unfair problem. And whatever DevOps is, it's not a technology, it's not a position that you hire. It's also that thing where people say like, oh yeah, we'll do DevOps because nobody knows what it means. So we'll just throw out all the stuff that we don't like all this hipster stuff, like CI and stuff. We'll just do DevOps, whatever that DevOps now is. And then people have like a dedicated DevOps team maybe. And kind of the idea of DevOps is to break down the silos, which is kind of ironic if you have a dedicated team to break down silos, which probably doesn't work that way. Yeah, automation is awesome, right? Unless you propagate something bad and then you need to fix everything again. What is that? And it's not Kevin Spacey. That's envy. Who has that? Craft everything yourself. We don't want to use any dependencies. We build everything ourselves. Anybody? Anybody has that colleague? Yeah. Everybody had that colleague, right? Like I told you, I had that colleague who started building their own encoding. This is not going very well. Some people like to use the dependency systems. Some are being used by the dependency systems. I don't know if you've ever used Maven, but this is probably very true. Who knows about pet versus kettle? That is not everybody. Okay, pets. Pets is, I remember when I got my first virtual server like a long time ago, I basically gave it a name and then I raised it by hand and I installed everything, and when it was sick or not doing what I was expecting, I would kind of try to fix it myself and would take good care of that. Whereas nowadays we're more in that kettle state. So kettle, they don't have a name, they're not raised by hand but in an automated fashion, and when they're sick, you basically shoot them so they don't infest the rest of the herd. And this is what you do with your servers now as well. Most of your servers probably are kettle, except, I don't know, Redis or whatever the special thing in your system is, which gets the healthcare and whatever they need. Use whatever automation you want. I use Ansible, but Puppet Chef are probably fine as well. I've just tried to stay away from them. Terraform is awesome to automatically create your stuff or your abstract your cloud things. Don't have pets anymore, or pets are nice, but probably only for stuff you don't do for a living. Yes, automate all the things. And then avoid drift. Or as some people say, you cannot have drift if you have everything in production. Or there's this other very nice saying that I've seen that everybody is deploying to production, but some people have the luxury to also have a development system working that they can try out stuff first, which might be true or not. This is a very interesting idea I've seen around. If you have proper monitoring, logging, and automation, you should never need to SSH into one of your instances manually. And if you need to do that, either your automation is broken or your monitoring is kind of broken. And then you need to fix that. And any instance where you manually SSH into that to change something should automatically be tagged to be removed and be replaced by a fully automated version again. That is one way to avoid drift and problems like that, where, oh, we've installed this version here and this software here, and probably everybody has this one system or multiple systems where, you know, if they go down, you will never be able to recreate them right or in that exact same way. Like, that will probably never run the same way it used to do. What is this? Except for Brad Pitt? Wrath or rage. Which is often like logging and monitoring when everything fails and you're very angry at your systems, like, what is going on? Yeah, I don't always monitor my stuff, but probably I should. We have some very fancy dashboards around that. I will have my talk right after lunch about like monitoring your PHP applications. I'll save that for later on. So to wrap up, there are no silver bullets in IT. And everybody who promises you that they have the silver bullet, don't believe them. And this is actually a good thing, because otherwise we would all be out of a job in a few years. But like the way it looks right now, it's probably not true, because everything is broken and everything needs work, and there is no final solution to everything. And yeah, if somebody promises you that Kubernetes is solving all your problems, it's also probably not true. And maybe your Kubernetes will turn into a Frankenetes at some point. Whatever the current buzzword is, it will not fix everything. So we've kind of looked at all these things. I hope you found yours. By the way, if you forgot the movie, there is like the 8-bit cinema, which is like, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes, where it's like, it looks like a game, and they play through the entire movie in a few minutes, which is also kind of cool. Any confessions? Anybody who wants to admit? By the way, before you run off or before you do questions, I always take a picture with you so I can prove to my colleagues that I've been working. Smile, everybody. You may wave as well. Wave, 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 wave. Very good. No, my colleagues don't know where I am most of the time, since I'm traveling always. So that's my way to prove stuff. We have 5 minutes. Yes, we're doing questions already. Any questions? Confessions? No confessions. Yes?
You said in your microservices slide that you would only split if it's too large to manage. Would you never split for technology reasons?
You mean because you want to use different technologies in the product? I have very ambiguous views about that. I know, for example, there is in Germany there's this very big e-commerce site, Zalando, and what they have done is like they have teams, and I think they are following that pizza rule, like you need to feed one team with one pizza, and like every single team can decide on their technology, which sounds interesting and might make hiring interesting, but the problem is, what if one team then like has somebody who is pushing everybody else to one technology? And it makes switching teams very hard. And if one team decides to use Haskell for their services, it might be a fun project, but it might not be a great solution afterwards. I get that you always want to try out new technologies, and that's fine. I'm just always cautious, depending on your company size or your team size, how many technologies do you really need? Because it might be all fun and games, but especially for monitoring and production use case, you need a lot of expertise for every single one of them, and you need probably dedicated tools for everything. And while it's again fun to throw that out as developers and like say like, oh, we'll use PHP here and we'll use, I don't know, pick whatever fancy programming language you come across on Hacker News tomorrow there, and then we'll try to string it all together, that will be pretty much a nightmare for ops.
I suppose there's a limit. For example, we standardize PHP.
Okay.
As no other language is allowed in production, but we do split applications based on frameworks.
Okay.
Useful libraries and stuff.
I mean, useful libraries, I understand. Why would you mix different frameworks? Or is it more of a migration strategy?
More migrations, and especially CMS systems.
Okay. But I don't know, CMS and microservices kind of like, I'm not sure where those are headed. Yeah, no, totally do that if you feel like it, but I'm always like, I always see a cost in that as well. By the way, time-wise, we're running just 15 minutes behind on schedule. We will catch it up over lunch break. So lunch will be only 45 minutes the way I understood it, but the next session will also start 15 minutes delayed. So no rush. Grab more stickers if you want more stickers. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah, please.
What would be your the sin that cost you most harm?
The sin that caused me most harm. So I've mostly avoided the cargo cult so far. It was probably not enough automation, or maybe that's also more of my ops background, because I remember at my previous company, when we set up the environment, it was all handcrafted, and we had basically a wiki where we documented like, these are the steps to create this instance, which was never up to date, and we would probably have never been able to recreate any of these servers anymore. And at some point we made like a big migration and replaced everything, and it was luckily in time before anything really bad happened. But I think for me, the handcrafting stuff, or that's maybe the ops perspective, was the one thing that would keep me up at night. Like, oh, you did some change, or it's just like, oh, you need to flip some DNS change, and then you do it manually, and you do something wrong, and you don't have it in source control because you do it in Terraform, and somebody else can review that. Stuff like that cost us some pain. Like I remember once we did a DNS switch, and I somehow copied the wrong DNS names, and they had unfortunately a very long time to live. So I think that we had like a time to live of 48 hours or 24 hours or something like that, and I made a switch and everything worked until like the next morning you suddenly saw like stuff dropping off and like your DNS entries disappear. And then you can fix them, but then you need to wait another 24 hours until your fix actually propagates. Luckily, it was a weekend, and it was like only an internal DNS name, and then we fell back to like having a hosts file, and then I hard-coded like the hosts file everywhere, fixing the DNS stuff. So that was kind of lucky, but that is one of the things, since it was just, okay, you log into AWS, you change your Route 53 settings, nobody else checked that, you made some copy-paste error, you screwed up everything. Automation could have saved a lot of stuff around that. So for me, that is kind of like the biggest thing. Right, but the idea is, A, ideally if it's an important change, it goes through some review and somebody else will look at it, and B, if you have a development system, you will try it out in your development system first. And
you know what's changed.
Yeah, and you keep track of what changes when, and then you kind of backtrace and only then try to roll it out to production. But yeah, obviously there are no guarantees. But yeah, for me, automation is the one thing that changed my life. Okay, I think we're exactly out of time. Thanks a lot.